last one.
Hi. Come take a seat. You know, sometimes I think it's just about the speaker. And then again, when I see us all chatting, hi, hello, Spike, hi, sit down. Then I know that it's about gathering on another level. So it's both. We need our wonderful speakers so that we gather. And once we're here, it's the gathering that really makes a difference. It's wonderful to know one another and to meet new people, new friends. And I love the way everyone reaches out. There's so much to say about Stephen Windmuller. He's not going to listen, it's embarrassing maybe, but he's worldwide renowned. PhD, I'm going to read some things. He is an American scholar. He is, and he's Jewish, a Jewish communal professional. And that means expert, and that means researcher. And he speaks all over the country and beyond on issues that matter, current issues, Israel and United States and America, and where we're going, and the anti-Semitism issue, and what our future looks like. And he bases it on his research and statistics. And he's going to share today with us, well, right here, right now. It's right behind me. And you can see it, and he's going to, he will begin, and then you will take questions after you speak on everything. Okay, and we will run with the microphones and help out. And if you have a question, comment, I hope you'll raise your hand after he speaks, and we'll do our best to capture you in a timely and manageable order. And Stephen Windmuller. I could have said so much more.
Good morning, and thank you, Judith, for the introduction. Now, Judith and I, among others, including Peachy, we study together as part of a group, so there's a deeply rooted connection here that I really appreciate. I'm so thrilled to be with you this morning, despite the topic, but the opportunity to study with you and to learn together is really very meaningful to me. In the last 24 hours, a lot has happened, as we know, not only on the streets of Los Angeles, but with regard to the question that we are going to be addressing this morning. Currently in the House of Representatives, in the Homeland Security Committee, is a hearing on anti-Semitism, at which point a number of national Jewish organizations are presenting. Secondly, yesterday, as you may know, the United States requested the extradition from Canada of a Pakistani individual who was planning a major attack this fall on American Jews in the New York metropolitan area, who had gathered a huge amount of weaponry and had begun to organize the massive destruction or death to significant numbers of Jews. A few days ago in Reseda, on some of the major thoroughfares in Reseda, an Iranian-American gentleman who had an Israeli flag, even though he is himself not Jewish, was accosted and physically attacked and told to go to his homeland, whatever that may have meant to him, but it was the implication, of course, that he should go to Israel because he was obviously Jewish if he's flying the Israeli flag. And so he was berated and physically accosted. And those stories keep going, in addition to an announcement earlier today that Leland Lerman was named by Robert Kennedy Jr. to head MEGA, the Make America Healthy Again, which is the replacement for the medical authority group that had been disbanded by Mr. Kennedy to provide guidance on American medicines and vaccines. Leland is a grandson of the founder of Rite Aid, Louis Lerman, but he himself is a self-hating Jew. And in his writings and comments, he has adopted the protocols of the Elders of Zion. He believes that 9/11 was a Mossad conspiracy, and he continues to offer the notion that only Jews and Chinese did not come down with COVID because they somehow knew in advance the remedies for protecting themselves against the vaccine and acquiring the vaccine and against becoming ill. So conspiracy theories do not limit themselves to folks outside of the Jewish community, but can also be driven by folks who despise their own identities and their own sense of community. What we know about anti-Semitism, of course, is quite old. And what we know is that it has a theological basis to it in the New Testament, and that religious hatred is still perceived by many of us as the core ingredient to driving even contemporary and new forms of such hate. But we saw a lot of this evolve through medieval mythologies and medieval behaviors. The Jews poisoned the wells, or any number of other thematic ideas that were part of the medieval era. We're aware in more contemporary times of the 19th and 20th century works that were done on eugenics and race theory, and the efforts applied by the Nazis to invoke those ideas in their own ideology. No doubt the 1902 Protocols of the Elders of Zion created their own notions of conspiracy and continue to sort of reap their own benefits or followerships. Even after the Shoah, even after 1945, efforts to deny the existence of the Holocaust continue, as we know, well into this century. And the idea, as introduced at the United Nations in 1976, that Zionism is a form of racism, and the corresponding rise of BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions directed against Israel, all have their roots certainly in much of the 20th century and its second half evolution. And finally, what we would see in the 21st century is the coming of age of the alt-right, those groups on the far right, as referenced in Charlottesville in 2017, and postmodernism, which is on the left, which we will talk more about because it is profoundly important, and we missed, that is, the American Jewish community misread the implications of this already going back to the 1970s and 80s. So these then frame much of what we'll be talking about because this is all rooted in time, place, and history. The current, as well as older forms of anti-Semitism, as reflected since the 7th of October, are reflected in these 5 ideas. The notion of dual loyalty, the idea of deicide and blood libel, the Holocaust distortionism, and a kind of notion of collective Jewish responsibility, and of course the issue of denying the legitimacy of the State of Israel. All 5 of these have been expressed in different ways on college campuses, in media, in the social media context, and are seen also in terms of public statements both at the United Nations and elsewhere directed against Israel, but more broadly against global Jewry. So they frame what we are seeing and have seen since the 7th of October 2023. What I think we need to understand is that the delivery systems of anti-Semitism in this period of history is fundamentally different from what we have seen at any other time, and that's driven by social media. It's generally the view of those who study anti-Semitism that the reason it has become such a kind of contagious or challenging problem at this moment is the capacity of those who use and read and apply social media to be able to take these tropes and bring them forward as such. But the messaging is today very different as well. And that is because postmodernism has brought to us intersectionality, critical race theory, and in doing so has allowed for a different set of ideas to percolate behind left of center, far left political thought and belief. Intersectionality, the notion that all minorities share an experience of racism and racial exposure, with the exception of Jews, because Jews are perceived no longer as a minority. We are perceived as powerful, and by definition, we are colonialists, apartheidist Zionists. We'll see more of that reflected later. Critical race theory from the 1970s comes to us on the notion that people who are brown and black and perceived as minorities, by definition, because they are non-white, are therefore experiencing racism in all different forms, economic, social, political. And critical race theory has been employed to be used as part of the attacks against Jews as being a powerful group committing acts of racial injustice and economic exploitation. What we have also come to note in the more recent times is the arrival on the right of Christian nationalism. And there we have come to see some really important ideas about the notion that America is a Christian nation and ought to return to its Christian roots. Now, this is part of the 2024 political ideology that was put forward. And so we need to understand it as both something that's very much alive politically, but has deeper roots in Christianity in America, especially in the evangelical world, or in parts of the right-wing political behavior. What we also need to account, which we've always understood is important, when there is economic dislocation, meaning when people are in crisis economically, loss of jobs, sense of disconnect from society, that the turn to finding scapegoats, seeking out answers, has often led to finding fault with Jews as being powerful interlocutors who control and manage a society. And no doubt the pandemic itself produced a huge amount of conspiracy theories about Jews controlling, Israel controlling the pandemic or having created it. All of this is about trust. And the trust factor in America today is a really significant issue because since 1970, political scientists have been telling us that Americans have lost confidence in Congress, in the presidency, in the courts, in economic institutions, in cultural organizations, and in religious structures. So when a society loses faith and belief in the core institutions of its infrastructure, this is highly problematic to minorities and, in our case, particularly challenging. So the trust has driven, in my mind, the use of social media, has assisted in the rise of postmodernism, has contributed to Christian nationalist thought and action. So if we look at 2014 to 2023, according to the Anti-Defamation League, we see this extraordinary growth of anti-Semitism. So a number of us were asking the question, why in this past 10 to 15 years has this happened? So the Southern Poverty Law Center is telling us that this is dated to 2008 in particular. Barack Obama wins his first term as president, and what they began to note is the rise of huge numbers of militia groups, of the Proud Boys, of other extremist groups, the reintroduction of the Klan, and so many other groups. So that this is a phenomenon that we would begin to sort of track from 2008 moving forward, of a kind of deeper divide and a deeper sense of disconnect of folks with the social norms of the society and with beliefs in the democracy that we had created. So we now have the latest data, the 2024 inventory report of the ADL, which points to 9,000 plus incidents of anti-Semitism, and ADL measures those in three categories: assault, harassment, and vandalism. So that's a 5% increase from the year before, but as you see over the 10-year period, it is an extraordinarily huge jump, which has led them to suggest that on average, there are 25 incidents of anti-Jewish behavior in this country per day, or one event per hour. I then went to the federal hate crimes statistics because the federal government also monitors this, but uses a different sort of formula: racial hatred, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, and ancestral sort of matters of measuring behavior. Again, these numbers show a marked increase over previous years, and these are 2023 data points, and provide us with the fact that they looked at 11,000 incidents to sort of create this sort of framework of outcomes. No doubt the Gaza conflict itself is a kind of driver of much of what more recently we have seen. And here again, the data suggests some very heightened attentions. But here, the point is being made that there is a deeper divide between Republicans and Democrats in this country over Israel and over Israel's conduct. And you see here a growing involvement of Democrats in support of Palestinians, and a continued strong presence of Republicans in defense of Israel. For the first time since we've studied behaviors about how Americans view the Middle East, for the first time since those studies began, we now have fewer than 50% of Americans who support Israel. And this is a huge shift from the 75% that we would have even 5 years ago to 46%, which is the current sort of marker for support. So where is this anti-Semitism appearing? So at the top of this slide, it suggests that there are 5 areas where we see most of it. And this is coming to us by American Jews reporting to the American Jewish Committee what they are experiencing. So 55% indicate it's on Facebook, where someone's targeting them, attacking their messaging, or just noting that they're Jewish and therefore discounting them. But also on YouTube, Instagram, Clubhouse, and TikTok, where we also see significant examples of anti-Jewish expressions that American Jews are experiencing. So we then asked the American public, do you see this as a problem? And in this 2023 study, if you took together, it's a serious problem and somewhat of a problem, obviously the numbers are quite significant, suggesting that Americans understand that this is not the norm, and this is something to be concerned about. Where only 4% saw it as no problem, the vast majority of Americans are beginning to understand its significance. How do we define anti-Semitism? Now, there's a war inside the Jewish world by not over definitions, and there are 3 international definitions now floating around. This one is the one accepted by 34 countries, including the United States, and by the State of Israel, and it's prepared by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. It's a very long statement. What I have extracted here is simply a sort of summary outcome. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, towards Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. What this definition does in its 27 paragraphs is take us through all the other manifestations or expressions of anti-Semitism, including criticisms of the right of the State of Israel to exist. Now, the opponents of this definition have argued that the definition is too broad and too defining. You should be able to criticize Israel, and how do you determine what's the difference between criticism of Israel and attacking the right of the state to exist? So that's one of the battlegrounds over why we have three such statements, and it creates, of course, the controversy over how do you actually define and employ a definition of anti-Semitism. So here's our friend Elon Musk, who, as you know, has been a sponsor of Twitter. And what other groups are telling us, African Americans, Latino Americans, gay and lesbian groups, we too are experiencing, because of such social media devices as Twitter, significant hatred, employing the social media tools to achieve it. So I simply inserted this to remind us that what American Jews are experiencing is something that is also very much evident, sadly, amongst Latino, Asians, African Americans, gay and lesbians, among others. So we do know, of course, how Jews feel about anti-Semitism, and we have a number of studies, one of which is the largest one, the Pew study of 2020, which we've used for other purposes, but in this case, 9 out of 10 American Jews are telling us anti-Semitism is something they worry about. And that number has increased, as you see, to a very high percent. Over 75% saw this over those 5-year periods from 2015 to 2020 as growing in concern. And 53% of American Jews 5 years ago said they felt unsafe, and we would project that that number is even higher today, especially after the 7th of October, where many Jews are telling us that they will not wear in the public square anything that defines or identifies them as Jewish, a kippah, a Star of David, or any other insignia. I mean, we know that hate in America is an old idea and unfortunately rich in the history of this nation, and has taken different forms. At times it's been voter suppression, as we know. It's been immigrant bashing. It's also seen in the political discourse we carry. And sadly, it's also directed in very actual terms against the physical well-being of people. And now we would add social media. So here I inserted Simon Montefiore, who is a prominent British historian. And the reason I inserted him here is that Simon Montefiore, in his latest books, is suggesting the following thesis, which we can take or leave, but I think we need to look at it. He said, what happened in the world between 1945 and 2019 was an extraordinary moment in history. We moved from periods of war and conflict to no world wars and to a kind of global recognition that we were all connected. So global trade increases, the idea of global participation expands, human rights and civil liberties are expanded upon, and in every category of sort of social norms of behavior, the world improved itself in terms of how people treated other people. And what Montefiore is suggesting is that we misread that that was a moment in time, unique in history, and what he is postulating is that we are returning now, because The war in Ukraine is a symbol of that, and wars elsewhere in the world, suggesting that we are going to return to the more traditional patterns of conflict, nationalism, and isolationism. And with that, he suggests, comes more hatred and more sort of disrespect and the loss of sort of a sense of trust in other peoples. With it has also come what we would have expected. Since 2023, American Jewish institutions have all adopted the issue of anti-Semitism as part of their protocols. Not only have they adopted it, but we have added multiple new organizations, including this one, the Foundation to Combat Anti-Semitism, which was founded by the owner of the New England Patriots, as just another effort at being responsive or feeling the need to be responsive to anti-Semitism. So what has happened is we have generated a huge infusion of money and institutional response to the events over the past 2 years as a way to sort of monitor and respond and deal with this question. So your next question ought to be, so are we coordinating a kind of national or even international strategy in the fight against anti-Semitism? And as you could expect, the answer is sadly and tragically no. There was an initiative 1 month after October 7th on the part of the major American Jewish groups to really deal with public relations, community organizing, and the fight against anti-Israelism in particular. That collapsed and has not been regenerated. So in the absence of a kind of uniformity of activity and coordination, I have to tell you candidly, we have simply not delivered on that. Now, even this morning's presentations in front of the House Committee on Homeland Security would reflect the diversity and the siloed behaviors of American Jewish institutions. And that is a tragedy that I think historians will write about, because we haven't quite figured out that we've got a shared problem with, at the moment, multiple and non-connected responses. So here are just sort of more examples of what we've seen happen in this country over the past number of years, and I don't need to go into all of them. On the college campus scene, 147 universities were impacted by the events of last spring. But we estimate from the FBI's data that no more, now remember how many kids are on college campuses, but that no more than 20,000 students collectively across the United States actually participated in these demonstrations. Some of them, of course, our own kids, but the reality is we somehow have a distorted view that all students, all faculty, sort of engaged in these sort of high-profile photos and images of the college scene. Yes, they occurred at major campuses, and that we have to acknowledge. They have to be held accountable, that we also would acknowledge. But what we need to understand is, in relative terms, the number of people actually demonstrating was really a very small percentage. This is the most scary piece of this presentation, because this tells us something we did not expect to hear or to absorb. The data on this slide are about people 18 to 35 years of age, the Gen Zs, the millennials. And this is an ADL study, and you can question the study, which some of us certainly are doing. But what it is designed to tell us is that young Americans have a far higher degree of hatred or misinformation, to start with, against Jews, about Jews, than their parents or grandparents. Now, we would have assumed quite the reverse. Younger people, more informed, have more access to information. The use of all the new technologies would suggest quite the reverse. That is simply not the case. We believe, based on this data, that 24% of Americans, as a result of younger people in particular, that 24% of Americans today hold anti-Semitic perspectives. Now that goes back We haven't seen those numbers since 1940s. So that suggests to us that we are really in a very different moment in time, and especially driven by young folks. So if 70% of young Americans believe that Jews stick together more than other groups, or that 53% believe that Jews hire only Jews over others, or that 39% believe that Jews are more loyal to Israel than to America, and so forth. Now, the ADL comes to this using something very interesting, and I think questionable, but nonetheless, we have to live with what data we have. They have 11 points to measure anti-Semitism. And I urge you to go look at their site to read all 11. It deals with business, it deals with loyalty, it deals with hanging out with their own, it deals with power, and so forth. So these 11 indices are measured. And if you score, according to the ADL, 6 or more as being problematic, that is, I believe that Jews have too much power, and then 5 more of those, you are then targeted or charged as being an anti-Semite. So that's how they account for measures of who's an anti-Semite and who is not. So I'm not sure that's the best measure, but it's a 1970s model that ADL continues to use even under Jonathan Greenblatt today. The data, however, which Greenblatt rolled out a year ago about this particular generation is really what is disturbing. And for us, that becomes maybe the headline in terms of how we move forward or will need to move forward. So as I mentioned, 24% of Americans hold anti-Semitic views, and that's based on the ADL perception. But the higher numbers here, as you will see, that is in percentage terms by age, so that older Americans are less anti-Semitic, but millennials and Gen Zs score much higher in terms of their views, negative views about Jews. And so when you add that together with what we are seeing politically on the far right and the far left, you begin to get this scenario. So today, American Jews are perceived to be powerful. And on the right, it's perceived as that we are seeking to replace white Anglo-Saxon Americans, and that was the message we heard in Charlottesville. Replacement theory, which was the notion that the Proud Boys, the Klan, and the others suggested to us, was that Jews will not replace us. You remember those lines in Charlottesville? Well, that's based on this notion that Jews are seeking to put themselves, their allies, and who are their allies, African Americans, Latinos, and Asians, into positions of white power, of replacing whiteness. On the far left, the argument is that Jews have lost their minority status because they are now white. They've become white because they have assumed the powerful roles in business, government, industry, and as a result are the oppressors, the racists. And as we would understand, this creates, therefore, the notion, are Jews white people? And this is the argument that the left versus the right is throwing at us. So we've been studying anti-Semitism for a long time, and in the 20th century, there were all these different initiatives. The oldest notion was that we would contain anti-Semitism. We would treat it as if it was a disease, and therefore we would use inoculation. We would educate everyone about who Jews were as a way to prevent or decrease the amount of prejudicial attitudes or ideas about Jews. We then moved to the notion how Jews conducted themselves also defined anti-Semitism. Jews needed to behave properly. So that was a 1920s notion. And then, of course, we used a good deal of educational initiatives from the 1930s forward. And then the American Jewish Committee decided in the 40s, when Hitler came to power, to study how does authoritarianism take place. And what can we do to prevent it? And who are these people that rise to such roles as Mussolini, Stalin, and Hitler? So they studied the authoritarian personality, materials written at Stanford, funded by the AJC, and all of which was designed to sort of explore the sort of origins of authoritarianism and human behavior using the psychological models of such forms. The 1950s was all about using elites. That is, if the Jewish community could get to the leadership of the banking industry, the real estate industry, and across the board, it would be possible to move behavior such as denying Jews jobs in banks, in other industries. They would be welcomed in. And indeed, that was one of the most successful enterprises called Executive Suite, the effort to really provide ways to influence elites to say, Jews are a part of America, and let us work and live in the circles that you enjoy and participate in. That worked in the 50s. It will not work in the 21st century because elites don't have power and influence any longer. Everyone is the sovereign self. Everyone is influential because of the impact of social media. So all of this has transformed itself away from systems of accountability and leadership to the collapse of all of that. Certainly in the 70s and 80s with Meir Kahane, we saw a lot of physical pushback of Jews carrying guns, of the belief that only Jews could protect themselves. And then we would begin to see hate legislation designed to sort of say it was a crime to commit acts against Jews and others. And we would begin in the 21st century to look at other theoretical principles, the last two being motivation theory, what motivates a person to act out his hatred, and stereotyping. How does stereotyping come into being and how can we respond to it? So the point being, there's a lot of effort at examining the strategies and ideas of fighting anti-Semitism, but at the moment, those are not coordinated and collaborative in the way they are being delivered. For me, the next steps for us will be security first. As you may know, in the current budget of the United States, there is a proposal for the continuation of $275 million for the security protocols. The Jewish community has requested a doubling of that amount. It does not appear that that will go through the Congress in this new budget, but I just wanted to bring you up to date on that. I think because this is a reality that younger folks are the most vulnerable and certainly the most likely to carry forward these ideas, a lot of attention and work has to be paid specifically to that arena. And I think we need to retool. I think some of our ideas, our definitions, the organizing systems we're using to fight anti-Semitism are not currently working, and we need to rethink both strategy and coordination. And I think we need difficult but real conversations with folks that were once our allies and are now critical of Israel and critical of American Jews. And we need to work to rebuild many of those discussion points and areas of importance. We used to run a good deal of stuff related to interfaith dialogue. Here in this city, Catholic Jewish Women's Dialogue, among other such groups. That's all disappeared. And what we may want to think about is revisiting the question of discussions across the board about religious differences, Israeli politics, race and culture with groups that we need to be talking to. And we need to figure out what will make us feel safe and what will make others feel safe if we are going to be effective in moving all of this forward. And we're going to be dealing for the next 3.5 years with an administration that itself can and does often fuel divides and discourse that can be highly problematic. And we're going to have to figure out ways to effectively respond to that, and we haven't done so to date. So I think these then become the multiple steps that continue to evolve. Yes, we should be pursuing such things as hate crime legislation as far as it will take us. And yes, we will need, as we've suggested, these coalitions and public discourse. And we will need to figure out a way to manage social media in a way that accounts for truth and reasoned judgments. And that is a difficult one because of the question of First Amendment rights, freedom of speech. But it is one that we have not effectively managed. And despite the efforts of the ADL, the American Jewish Committee, and other groups in Silicon Valley to try to deal with that, we haven't figured out a way forward in managing the best legal means for the control of social media. And yes, we can try elites as buffers, but I don't think that will work. And I think we have to continue to support groups in both Jewish and elsewhere in the society that are monitoring hate institutions, hate messaging, as a way to call them out in terms of the impact that they are having in further dividing and dealing with this society. Final note, anti-Semitism has always been with us. Yes, we are living in a particularly difficult time with it. And yes, we will see it play out in so many different ways. One of such example of it was in San Francisco this past weekend in the Mission District. A Jewish business was targeted as part of the anti-ICE gatherings and swastikaed and the store was looted. So what we understand is that anti-Semitism is not always limited to a particular moment or action, but sometimes sort of feeds into the other issues that we are living with at any given moment. Hopefully we can find common ground. Hopefully we are able to deal with the imprint and impact of social media. And finally, hopefully we as Jews can find ways to be articulating what we need and what we require as part of being active in this society. Thank you.
Wonderful. What I would like to say, and I probably should say it 27 times before tomorrow, is what I heard when you said we need to revive Catholic women's dialogue, we need to revive it. Tomorrow's that opportunity from 12 to 2 right here. Our Rachel Timoner, Rabbi Rachel Timoner, and her sister Andi, a documentarian, they have done, Rabbi Timoner has connected with a church in Prospect Park in Brooklyn, New York. They put together a film. They've worked together for 5 years, this church and Rachel Temple. And tomorrow we'll screen that film, 12 to 2, with discussion to follow. She's here, Rachel's here on sabbatical. Her sister lives here in Los Angeles, in Pasadena, lost her home, but she's moving forward. And I encourage you to come and to tell your friends to come to see it. I think it's the beginning of what we need to do as a community at Leo Baeck Temple and as a subset, community of engagement elders. We need to be promoting these kinds of programs for ourselves. Now, if you have comments or questions beyond that, please raise your hand and Lisa will find you. Where's Lisa? Thank you.
I'm just interested in the list of next steps or responding. You don't have how to bring all the Jewish institutions together to support us. I say this from my own, I guess, a personal experience. I recently retired from the city of LA, and in my department, I was appalled when I saw the proposed motion. Oh, I'm sorry. I was appalled when I saw the proposed motion that asked the city council to take a position on what's happening with Israel and Gaza. And this was a year or more ago. It turned out there were very few Jewish people in my department at the time. We got together. we reached out to the Federation. We never really found in my opinion, I didn't find the support that I thought, that I was looking for personally. It was enlightening that there weren't a lot of Jewish staff in our department to pull together. That was enlightening to me to begin with, but why is that not on your list, that an effort of a coordinated response, which you talked about?
Well, I think it has to be driven bottom up. It's not going to come top down. And it requires audiences of all types to sort of press the institutions of which they are a part to figure out ways to break down silos and to do more of this kind of coordinated effort. And to demand of Jewish institutions like the Federation that it, because of its centrality, its role, that it can be a player in that kind of discourse of bringing groups together, as it ought to be.
Stephen, how does intermarriage fit into all of this? There's so much of that now.
How does intermarriage fit into all of this? Well, I mean, I think the first job is for us to help those within our own community who are Jews by choice or new to our community to fully understand the history of this experience and to help them understand the emotional and deep feelings that go along with this, which they may have on their own, but we may be able to provide some additional resources. What I believe is actually very useful is that Jews who are themselves Latino or African American or from the Middle East, they can be what I guess I would call translators. They can transmit to circles, whether they are necessarily active in some of these circles or not. They have a much better chance to speak to folks who share their Hispanic culture, their roots in the Middle East, or their commonalities of religion from an earlier religious life, to help sort of translate who we are, what we are, and why we, struggle with these issues at this moment, as a way to help bridge building. So in that sense, the intermarriage or interreligious worlds can be very useful.
I had two comments. Well, one a question, but comments. One is I have a slight disagreement with the statement you made about the current young people as being well informed. They are not. They don't read newspapers. They get whatever news they get from social media, and this is problematic. I mean, from my perspective. So that was the only thing. I really think we should all go back and read Simon Montefiore's work, because that to me was very interesting. The question that I had for you was the editorial. Now I'm trying to pull it up. The editorial by Tom Friedman was yesterday in the electronic edition, but the title of which is This Israeli Government is a Danger to Jews Everywhere. It's very long. And it's something that I've been thinking about. I would love you to just address this, because people equate Jews with Israel, the behavior of Israel now, and that to me is something that we have to somehow get beyond. I'm sorry. Here. Thank you.
So the Israel story is Judith, you'll have to invite me back to do the piece on after October 7th in terms of what it's done to the American Jewish community. And what that has led to is a kind of sad but very real divide of many American Jews, especially some of our grandkids and kids who sort of come to the Israel story later. I mean, they do not know and did not live through 48, 67, 73, and so forth. So as a result, their perception of Israel is Bibi Netanyahu, and their views of Israel is a far-right governmental imagery. And that has created a huge divide in the Jewish community. And if you look at the data points of conservative and Reform Jews versus Orthodox Jews in terms of the sense of connectivity and loyalty and ties to Israel, we are seeing this sharpening divide of fewer and fewer conservative and Reform Jews holding the same degree of love for, connection to Israel. Now, what they're really talking about is the government of Israel, and not the idea of Zionism and Israel and the Israel dream, but a very particular ideological perspective as defined in this moment. And here again, we have the opportunity to press the Israelis quietly, but nonetheless directly, that the effect of what is happening on the ground in the Middle East has profound implications in London, Paris, Berlin, Los Angeles, and elsewhere in terms of behaviors of people who don't care about Israel or don't know the story of Israel, and to American Jews who've become disenchanted and troubled and very angry at what they are seeing, and the divide in the Jewish community that has resulted. So, I mean, I don't know how else we could frame this than to be quite candid that we're at a tipping point in terms of that relationship.
My question was very, very similar, because this is all tied to a reaction to what Israel is doing. Okay, so first of all, I think most people don't make the divide between the state concept and what's, the government. Oh, yeah, okay. Most people don't see the separation of supporting this concept of that we need a place, and they see just the current government because it seems to go on and on and on. But if the anti-Semitism is a reaction to what Israel is doing, then the concept isn't really, people aren't saying, oh, they have wonderful intentions. They're seeing what is happening. And I know it's a very progressive idea to think that there are aggressors and victims, and that we are now an aggressor and nobody knows we were victims for 5,000 years, and that's where they've got us pegged. And I don't see many, you refer to it, many Jews don't agree with it, and so I've heard of temples where they openly support the Palestinians. So that's a huge problem, as we've been saying, Do I have a question? What? I'm so sorry. In addition, a question. What can we do? Oh, you have said try and educate. That's not working. That's not working. So what else can we do? None of these things are working.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, there are a lot of folks struggling with these questions. It's not as if, we've left everything to the mega Jewish organizations. So as Judith knows, I just participated in something called the Summit Games. The Summit Games is 60 of us were invited to New York to play a series of games about the Jewish future. So what will the Jewish community look like in 2050? And how did we get to those points? So two of the scenarios, all of which were written by Dara Horn, the writer, brilliant writing, by the way, And Dara had two very positive scenarios for the American Jewish community in 2050 and two horrendous ones. And our job was to figure out how this all happened. But the larger question, which will come back to the Jewish community in a few weeks and months, is this material will become available so we can play these games, or a game, about the Jewish future. And we don't necessarily need to depend only on institutions, but we can begin to think about how we re-envision what Jewish life might look like if we had these as our goals for 2050 and these as the outcomes. So in the 60 of us who are playing games, and we are not permitted to always, at this point, to share all the names of, because this was all done confidentially. There were Hollywood types, and there were radical folks on the left and some on the right, and there were very prominent Jewish national figures, and then there were just people like Windmuller. And we played 2.5 hours for each round, and we played 3 rounds. And what we all agreed, from whatever perspective, that where we are is not where we want to be. Neither those bad outcomes that Dara wrote about, for sure, but that would require a very different kind of Jewish organizing. And we had to rethink the way in which the community itself was operating. That maybe we have a 19th century model dealing with 20th century questions, living with 21st century people, and we need a very different way of addressing Jewish agendas. So I think that has some promise. And amongst those 60 people were some very young folks who are doing some extraordinary things about, for example, on social media, trying to counter all the misrepresentations on Jews and Israel and Zionism and Judaism, and other folks who are investing in looking at where the money is coming from, both from the Middle East and elsewhere, in terms of funding postmodernism and a lot of anti-Israel stuff on college campuses in the classrooms, and trying to sort of identify those sources as a way to push back and find ways to counter that. So there's a lot happening bottom up, and the gaming was just one of those examples.
Hi, first of all, thank you very much for today's. It's really an eye-opener. I feel betrayed. I feel betrayed. Feel betrayed by the Israeli government. As far as 5,000 years of history, it doesn't make any difference to the world. So now, if there isn't unanimity within the Jewish community, because Netanyahu is on one side and the right-wing Knesset people are on the, and then there are the other people, how do you face what the world is coming at in terms of anti-Semitism when we can't even get our own act together? That is the concern for me. I don't feel qualified, nor am I inclined to support Netanyahu. So how do you balance a slaughter in Israel of under 2,000 people and a slaughter of whoever they were, and it's Hamas's numbers, 30, 40, 50,000 people dead? How do you equate that to any kind of sanity? And how do you respond to people who think Israel is terrible?
That's not a fair question. That is the ultimate dilemma, I guess, is the way to yeah, I know. Of course it is, but it's the ultimate dilemma. Look, as Rabbi Chazin would teach us, in Jewish history we know that Jews, when they have failed to find common ground, their story ends in tragedy. I mean, we saw that in the decline of the First and Second Temple. We've seen it at other points in Jewish history. We actually saw it to some degree in the 1930s when really the American Jewish community was so slow and so inept in responding to what was happening in Nazi Germany. So I think it's history that is telling us if we don't get this right, we may not have an Israel, and we may also see a kind of an American Jewish community depleted and highly problematic in terms of its role or impact. So I don't think that this is a question that simply stops at the behavior or actions of one individual. It's a collective responsibility that we have to each other. And this is where the voices in our orbit of national Jewish institutions have to press the Israelis that the bottom line here is not just the welfare and survival of the state of Israel, but it's the security and ability of Jews elsewhere to also thrive and live.
One quick follow-up to that. When the pandemic hit, I took a Post-it and put it on my computer. It said 3 challenges. Keep your grit, keep your wit, keep your civility. The missing part here is civility. There is no middle ground. People do not want to hear with anybody else. You're wrong, and don't even try to tell me you are wrong. Well, with that, where do you make any progress? And that doesn't make it not, I'm not talking about Israel, I'm talking about the world. But in this case, since you're here, we're talking about Judaism.
Yeah.
And we are in a serious hole here because there is no middle ground. And without middle ground, you get nothing done. Look at the Congress. There's no middle ground. Look at today's society. There is no middle ground. And these kids who we're worried about, they're being fed, they're being fed by social media, but that's their thing. When we were watching Walter Cronkite, that was another story. And we felt and there were people who didn't agree with Walter Cronkite, and they thought he was a left-winger, okay? So in this case, I don't feel there's a rational approach to Israel unless there is some kind of middle ground. Where do we find it? That's also a question.
I'm thinking of the media, and I'm thinking of CNN's attempt to bring on a more conservative voice, as they have done. I'm looking for the day in the not too distant future when all media will mix it up so that I'm not just tuning in to MSNBC to hear the othering that goes on. You know, that's the media has a big responsibility. All those brilliant journalists, they really have a big responsibility, which is, you know, I don't want to say tell the truth because I know Jeopardy's the only game left doing that. But to give it so that I'm not listening to myself, and so that I'm not saying you are the bad people, so that we stop the othering and we become united. We've got to find a way to do that. And that's where my head is right now, based on what you've said in response.
So there's a group called Resetting the Table. So Resetting the Table is trying to create those conversations between the left and the right, those who are supportive of Israel and strongly defend Israel, and those who are unhappy and disconnected from Israel, and so forth. And it's one of several efforts to create the middle ground, the civility piece that's missing, because to hold communication requires that you hear the other and understand where he or she is coming from. And as a result, you know, changing the sort of scenario from I'm right, and, you know, and rejecting whatever you have to say, to a point of saying there's some truth in what you're saying, and hopefully you're hearing the truth that I have to offer.
We, during COVID, we did meet with them at Leo Baeck. There was a small consortium of people, and we were on a road. And then either they fizzled. I know there was a money component to having Resetting the Table. Husband and wife, conservative Jews, rabbis. I guess it's time to go back. And there's also Braver Angels. and we were on a fence whether we were going to work with Braver Angels, resetting the table. We need to pick it up. Thank you for reminding me.
I've mentioned this before, but I think an important book is Noah Feldman's book, To Be a Jew Today. I think I have the title correct. I'm not sure. I actually gave it to my oldest grandkid, who just graduated from college, because I know he doesn't feel particularly connected to the Jewish community, despite his last name, which is Goldstein. But I thought it was important. I said, you need to read this. And especially because of what he's currently doing, it's important for him to understand who he is as a Jew. And it's very difficult for many kids to accept their Judaism in light of what Israel is doing. And we cannot be equated with Israel. I think that's one of the issues. We are not responsible for the decisions that Netanyahu makes. And I want to remind everybody that every single day in Israel, there are thousands, tens of thousands of people who are protesting, like I hope everyone here will do on Saturday afternoon.
Well, thank you all very much for inviting me to the, oh, we have another question.
Can't forget.
Sorry.
You've talked so much in the last few minutes about what's going on with Gaza and Israel, but do you see it ending, and what do you see will happen in terms of anti-Semitism after the horror is off the news every day?
So, as you may know, the President of the United States informed the Prime Minister yesterday that he expects this war to conclude shortly. So, he said a lot more to the Prime Minister than what that line. He also informed the Prime Minister to stay out of what he's trying to do in Iran, and he doesn't want any Israeli interference in his initiatives there as well. So I think there's a degree of unhappiness in Washington with the Israeli conduct of this conflict. So that may help trigger the end to some of this, because the one thing that the Prime Minister does not want is to lose his friendship with his guy. And he wants to ensure that, or if he does feel that he needs to continue, he will do what he did with Barack Obama and make an end run and go to friends he has in the Congress to sort of bypass the White House. But that doesn't sit well with Donald J. Trump. But so I think that this war will likely see a kind of closure or downgrading for sure. But what it has left is really an emptiness, meaning there is no power structure in place in Gaza, other than now the existence of tribal and warlord type groups, because the Israelis have supported those groups to fight Hamas. And that has created its own sort of internal problems, because it means there are multiple mini armies at war with Hamas and maybe at war with one another. So we are hardly at a point of real closure, because we don't have a plan going forward. I don't know that the Israelis, and here I plead ignorance, I'm not sure the Israelis actually have a post-war plan. I do think some of the Arab governments do, but the question is whether the Israelis will welcome their input and engagement, and that's difficult to see. I mean, if it's left to the extreme right in Israel, it would be the removal of all of these folks to make Gaza a part of Greater Israel, just as their goal is on the West Bank to achieve this sort of Greater Israel ideology. One can only hope that smarter and more responsible heads of thought leaders will come into play to change the status quo in a way that returns power to people in Gaza, as much as one can eliminate Hamas as a force. And part of that, of course, is the decision of the government, which actually I think is the right decision, is to try in every way possible to prevent the use of tunneling and to close those tunnels or to destroy them as much as one can, because those were tools for terror, and they have to be somehow disbanded. But this is a long-haul subject of how do you reach millions of people whose lives, whose homes, and whose economy is totally devastated, and build something that they have hope. If they don't have hope, we will see more terror and more violence, and it will grow in ways that we certainly don't wish for Israelis or for the rest of the world.
Is Israel a Jewish state or a Jewish state?
If you asked the right wing, it is Jewish, and they could care less about democracy, but it is a Jewish national state. And that was the language used in the legislation of 2012 by the government to create this new national law, basically describing that the language of the country is Hebrew, and the destiny and focus of the country is about building a Jewish national identity. So it disparages Palestinians living in Israeli Palestinians, and it has no space or ground for those who are living outside of Israel but are part of what some would call the greater Israel.
Okay.
I guess there's more questions.
There, one more question, just to challenge you about, as if I could challenge you, about the influence that Trump could have on ending the war, because if Netanyahu accedes to Trump's desires and gets pushed out of power because of this, he has to go to the courts and maybe to jail. And, you know, I can't imagine that he would give up his present stance when he would suffer.
So two scenarios. There's a no confidence vote scheduled. There was a no confidence vote scheduled today in the Knesset. I haven't heard. I'm sure it failed, but there was such an effort. They constantly are coming up because the opposition is constantly trying to see if they can peel away 1, 2, or 3 members of Likud or one of the other coalition partners on some issue. So this is happening regularly. The second is, I am convinced the Prime Minister, before he leaves office, will work on a deal with the Attorney General and the police to figure out a way forward that does not include jail time for his wife, for his son, or himself. So my sense is that really won't be the driving issue. But this Prime Minister really believes he has a mission which is driven by his father and his brother, and he sort of sees that he has a responsibility to defend and protect and advance the Likud agenda. And as much as Bibi believes that, it's going to take others to bring him down, and hopefully we will one day see that.
We want to thank you. The people who were at, there's more? Okay, just one more. Wait, you needed, people at home need to hear you.
Is there any organization among the Arab states to try to find some solution to welcome some of the Palestinians to their countries or to help in any kind of developing of beginnings of a new nation?
Well, I mean, I don't know the Arab world well enough to know specific organizations or infrastructures, but I do know that the governments of some of these countries are really committed to figuring out some longer-term solutions to these questions of Palestinian coexistence Here you need a Middle East expert to walk you through what's going on in the Arab world, which is actually fascinating because the Arab world is very different from what we understood it to be even a few years ago as a result of Syria, of Lebanon, of what's happening with the Abrahamic Accords. And this is to Donald Trump's credit. This is one of the extraordinary breakthroughs that his first term did deliver. And if you want to read more about Donald Trump and his first term, my book, The Impact of Donald Trump's Presidency on American Jews in Israel, Purdue University Press, USC publication, 2021, with 8 Democrats, 8 Republicans, and some other folks, takes a look deeply at Trump's impact and influence. And if you believe some of the authors in that book, not Windmuller, but some of them, Donald Trump is America's greatest president for the Jews.
Stephen, you have brought us so much today. You have brought us the games that we can be playing right here. You've brought us the concept again of resetting the table. You've brought us the concept also of finding commonality in those we don't agree with. I thank you very much. We all thank you very, very much. It was a wonderful morning.
this